Or I should do a super.
That's like your outtakes is like
a super cut of like behind the scenes where it's just
like,
every single time.
Hold on a second, I gotta go.
Yeah,
It's just gonna be like outtakes of like.
Yeah. Well, one more time.
Yeah.
Jesus.
You should do an
Like a
outtake.
doc. Welcome to the In the Field podcast, where we speak to veterans, service members, and those in the transition process to learn about their stories. Jason, thank you so much for being on the podcast. First question I ask all my guests: when was the last time you had an MRE?
Oh, well, first off, I was in the Air Force as a pilot. So the reality is I didn't have a whole lot of MREs. It's probably been 15 years, I'd say.
All right. Are you excited, nervous?
I'm intrigued. I think these look different even than I remember.
They do, yes. I don't know if we got knockoff MREs or if this is just the new design, but you have a pretty special MRE that none of us or no guests have had before. Which one did you pick?
So I've got, what is this? The pizza slice pepperoni.
It's an interesting pick. I feel like that is the most appropriate Air Force pilot choice of MRE. We've had Navy SEALs pick like the stews or the thing, and you're going pizza.
I'm going pizza. Well, the ones I remember were like the stroganoffs. I remember like the
Yeah.
beef stroganoff, and I remember that. Yeah.
Did you have a particular favorite MRE?
That's the again 15 years ago. I don't remember if I remember the names of the
That's
ones
fair.
that I ate.
Well, let's cut these things open and get into it. I decided on the tuna chunk light lemon pepper. For those listening or watching, it's 9 in the morning. No, sorry, 10 in the morning on a Monday, and so MRE's not necessarily the greatest breakfast in the world. But I felt like tuna was going to be an easy in on this start of the week. But the second question I have: do we go heated or unheated? Now, with my tuna, thankfully I don't actually have to heat this, but I feel like for pizza, you got to go heated.
I think you got to go heated, but I don't know how you heat pizza in a bag.
We're going to learn today. I don't think it comes with a personal pizza oven, but we'll see how it goes.
All right.
So as we look through some of these snacks and maybe do some trades, what do I have here actually?
Oh, this
Crackers, cheddar crackers.
There's your pizza.
Oh, that's beautiful.
That's the entree right there.
But this doesn't look like it's even meant to be heated. Usually it's in the like different kind of packet, but all right, we'll find this out or figure this out together.
And I like how the ingredients list is like 400 things that I can't pronounce.
It's very long. I mean, listen, it's not not delivery. It's MRE.
All right, a little peanut butter.
Ooh,
I remember
Reese's
the peanut
Pieces.
butter. Banana
Mayonnaise.
pumpkin puree.
Oh, I guess it is tuna. It's gonna have mayonnaise in it. Yeah. Tortillas.
And chocolate protein drink.
So when you had MREs, did you ever drink I love these were my favorite, just the lemon lime. You throw that in your
I do remember
Camelback.
those, yeah.
Yeah, and then you would regret putting in your Camelback because it would just like stain it or just keep the flavor in forever. Mr. Apple Pie dessert spread. Never seen this one before either.
Got a lot going on there.
All right, let's break open one of the snacks here. I'll open up the cheddar flavor snacks. What are you? What's going to be your first pick?
Well, actually, I'm looking. I've got crackers. Oh, I've got an oatmeal cookie.
All right, let's give that one a go. What's the story of Jason? Obviously, Air Force pilot. But in high school, did you know you wanted to enter the service, or what was the decision making at that time?
Yeah, for me, so I had a couple family members that were in the military. I had an uncle that was an Apache pilot, Gulf War I, era. And so I kind of grew up hearing some of his stories from, very young age. I had another uncle that was Vietnam era. He was also like a helicopter pilot, but he was, helicopter maintenance, enlisted like in Vietnam. I think he did 2 tours. And so I heard kind of his stories as I was growing up. And I think for me, those kind of like stood out, but my dad was a Boeing engineer and loved airplanes. So I was like indoctrinated more from, being in Seattle and like being around airplanes. And so flying was like a thing that I always really wanted to do.
Right.
And so, kind of mixing like some of the interest in these like uncles that were in, the military in various forms, with like really wanting to fly airplanes. I started flying when I was 17 in high school.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is like, I grew up in a town that's south of Seattle called Kent, Washington.
Yeah.
And they, to their credit, the school district had this incredible program that was a vocational program where they funded you to do my senior year, like do a class where I did ground school, like as a class, like, pilot ground school. And then the local, like flight school that was there in Auburn, kind of right near where I lived. I think we ended up with 10 hours of like funded through the school district. Wow. Flight time. And so you'd go up in a like little Cessna, 4-person Cessna with like 2 of your classmates and the instructor. So there's, 4 of you in the plane.
And they trusted high schoolers in an airplane.
Yeah, this is like 17. And I remember at the time, I mean, geez, like thinking back, this is like, I don't even know how we did this. We would swap midair. So we would like climb over each other in the plane, which I'm pretty sure I would never do now. As a pilot, like allow like anybody to do this.
Safety violation.
Oh my gosh,
but I guess.
What statute of limitations like 25 years ago,
It's fine. The FAA wasn't real at that point,
so like, and you each got 15 or 20 minutes out of that flight. Okay. It was pretty quick. But so I'm doing this vocational school my senior year, doing my ground school and all this stuff. And then early in that year, when I was in Boy Scouts, my scoutmaster was like, have you ever thought about going to like a service academy?
Yeah.
Or, one of those, you like flying, you're obviously into that. Like, he knew that I had some uncles that I had told stories about. And so ultimately he encouraged me to like apply for the Air Force Academy, apply for an ROTC scholarship and all that.
And at this point, so you were just flying for the sake of like, you enjoyed flying, not necessarily I'm learning how to
like
fly
at this time, I didn't know what the academy even was. Right. I didn't really even know what ROTC was. I just knew that I liked flying airplanes, and here's my scoutmaster at the time kind of saying, hey, have you thought about like doing flying in the military?
Right.
And I'm kind of going, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so I think you fast forward, through that, like I kept flying. So I went through my senior year and got that baseline flying experience. Yeah. And then the spring of my senior year, the guy that was like doing the kind of ground school in my high school was also at the flight school, the local like flight school. This was like, he'd come up for an hour a day, to teach this in the high school as a vocational thing. And he was like, hey, Jason, I know you're really into this. Like you got the ROTC scholarship at that time. I'd finally gotten that. And he was like, how about you go like work at a flight school over the summer and finish out your pilot's license?
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. So I went to Boeing Field, which is like, this very large airport just south of Seattle. And I worked what they call line services. And so I washed airplanes and fueled them and did all that.
Went through the ringer, had to pay your dues in order to get the privilege and opportunity to fly.
I did, yeah. And it at the time it was kind of a cliche in some ways, but it's like totally true. Like I found an instructor that was a brand new instructor, this guy that was looking to build hours. And so he instructed me for free. And since I was working at the flight school,
not bad.
I was getting, I think, a 30 or 40% discount off of the rate for the flight time. And so this is like, 1997 era. Right. And I think I paid like $35 or $40 an hour for the airplane. And then he instructed me for free and got me all the way through my private pilot's license before I entered college.
And so before we get into your college, so you had mentioned, looking into the academies, ROTC. What ended up happening there? Was it just based on who gave you the scholarship? Were you kind of trying to dead set Air Force Academy? What had happened in that decision-making process?
Yeah, so the way that I kind of went down that path is I applied for the academy originally, the Air Force Academy. Didn't apply for any of the other academies. Partially, I just didn't really know much about it, honestly. Really? It was like a knowledge gap. And I knew I wanted to fly airplanes, and my uncle at the time had said, well, he was in the Army, and he's like,
this is the Apache Army pilot. Airplanes that you could fly.
Yeah, well, yeah. So here's my uncle with this. Yeah, he's an Apache pilot, and he's Uncle Dan. And Uncle Dan is like, Jason, he's like, don't go into the Army. Go fly airplane. If you want to fly, go fly in the Air Force.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, cool. So I listened to Uncle Dan, and I applied to the Air Force Academy, and then by reasons that I still don't fully understand, and the Academy Liaison Officer, which is like this liaison officer that helps you in the application process. It's, usually a reservist or something that is helping you through this. My nomination, so you have to get a congressional nomination. Yeah. My nomination paperwork was like lost. So we submitted all my
Oof.
stuff and then didn't hear anything, like didn't hear positive or negative,
Yeah,
kind
just
of confirmation, nothing. And so he actually ended up calling the senator that I was trying to get I don't remember if it was House of Reps, if it was representative or senator, but we never heard back, and they were like, yeah, we don't have your paperwork.
Huh.
So the paperwork never went through, and so he ended up still getting me the option to go to the prep school, which I don't know if you're familiar with that or like.
Only because when I was on the enlisted route, I got offered green to gold, and so that was 1 year prep, then 4 years of West Point, and then a 6-year contract or something like that. So
Yeah.
it would have been like an 11-year commitment for me.
Yeah, and so like it would have been an opportunity to go do the 1 year prep school and then basically pseudo guaranteed admission into the Air Force Academy.
Yeah.
And that would have been the way to like mitigate this issue of my nomination never going through. And so that was an option. But then at the same time, I had applied for the ROTC scholarship. And the ROTC scholarship, you just applied, not like linked to a school. It's just a straight up college scholarship. And at the same time that this was all happening and I got offered the prep school kind of option, I got offered a 4-year scholarship through the ROTC stuff.
Yeah.
And I
At
kind of
that
sat
point,
there and I was
why
like,
do the extra year if unless you were dead set on absolutely the Air Force Academy, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, to some extent, when I got offered green to gold, 19-year-old Holden at the time there was a few things. One, I think I wanted a more quote unquote traditional college education or college experience. Having been enlisted, I felt I'm already getting the military experience. Do I necessarily want that in college? And then 2, 19-year-old Holden goes, well, I'm 19 now, 11 years all in, prep, school, and contract. I'm then going to be 31, which is what I am now. So I would just now be ending my military service, which is nothing wrong with that, obviously. At the same time, I mean, at that point, might as well just do 20, right? I mean, I'd be at 13 or 14 years, like, all right, 6 more years and I get to retire. I would be living a very different life. And obviously things ended up working well. And even if I went that route, things would have gone well. It just would have been very, very different. But at that age, it's such a big commitment that it's a pretty scary ordeal. Talking about lost paperwork, when I did get out and I was transferring from community college to a 4-year school, Duke lost my paperwork.
oh, no kidding.
So I'd gotten all the responses and I wasn't hearing anything from Duke. It was just still saying like processing or whatever. And I call them up and they're like, well, what's your name? And I give my name and they're like, we can't really find you. Let me call you back. And a couple days later, they're like, oh yeah, sorry. It was like misplaced. Like we found it now. And then next day, rejected. I'm like,
oh,
okay, so you just somehow lost it. And then we're like, oh yeah, you didn't get accepted.
We found it.
We found it. And you also,
and...
did not get in. Everything went well. So, I mean, things ended up going well. I guess the minor setback with the academy, but overall happy with the choice in college that you got. And before we go, I mean, give these cheddar crackers a try. What's great about this podcast is we get people to eat, so it makes it hard for them to talk as I ask questions. Those I'm pretty sure are just Cheez-Its.
Yeah, I was going to say that's just rebranded. I don't know if you want to try this.
We should say no name. I mean, right? I don't know. Cheddar's not, or Cheez-Its is not a sponsor of this podcast, so might have to be careful here. Oatmeal cookie.
And cookie's not bad.
That's a very
It's
good.
really hard.
Yeah.
The texture is not good, but it tastes really good.
I wouldn't be mad about that.
No, that's really good. Yeah, I think for me, I don't really look back and like have regrets or anything. I think all these things like you end up just working out in certain ways. At the time, I was a little bit bummed about the lack of even like knowing whether or not I got into the academy. So I think there was like a sense of like that just didn't feel fair.
Well, I mean, the frustration of it's out of your control too.
It was out of my control, and I was like it was like a walking kind of like stereotype of like all of the things you were supposed to do. I was an Eagle Scout.
Yeah.
I had good grades. I'd like, done all the volunteer stuff. All like the captain of the cross country. I checked all these boxes that they say are so important for the academy. And so, for me, it was all mostly just like disappointment that I didn't even get to hear whether or not I got in.
Yeah.
And then make the choice. So the choice was taken out of my hands, but it didn't matter because like the ROTC scholarship was still an incredible deal.
Yeah.
And then that opened up, options too, because the way that the scholarship was structured, you can kind of use it wherever. For me, the primary options I was exploring was Rice University and the University of Texas in Texas, obviously in Austin, and then University of Washington.
So I didn't know this. So the ROTC, it's not school dependent. It is you get the ROT scholarship and then you can apply it to whichever school.
At that time,
Okay.
yeah, I don't know what it is now, but
Okay.
at that time it was literally just a 4-year scholarship. Now the way that it was set up though, it was I don't remember if it was capped or if it was tied to state tuition. I think it was actually capped, if I remember, on the amount that it was worth each year. And so to University of Texas Austin's credit, I was out of state, applying to UT. And so I'd reached out to the RTC unit there and said, hey, can you like work out a deal where like UT will like bring me to in-state tuition, so that the scholarship would have covered all of my, tuition costs there. And they actually did that. So they had at this time, I don't know if it's still a thing, but back then they were able to basically offer me, hey, if you come and you're on scholarship, we'll give you the in-state tuition rate.
Nice.
And then the scholarship would have covered everything. But it was conditioned if I ever went off of scholarship, I was immediately back on out-of-state tuition.
Got it.
And so, at the time I was kind of sitting there like University of Washington is a terrific school and like it was, no risk in terms of like going there. So I ended up choosing that option and going to the University of Washington.
How did you like your experience there? What was your life like, University of Washington, and then also trying to balance ROTC while going to school?
I think, I went in there and again, I was totally naive to what, ROTC was, and what kind of the lifestyle. Although I had these uncles.
You didn't do JROTC.
No, I didn't do JRTC. I didn't do any of this. And then although I described these uncles, they were uncles that like I knew they didn't live locally, So from a
Just
military perspective,
stories.
my parents were in the military. Like, I didn't really have any immediate family that, I was going in there. And so I went in there kind of just like thinking like, oh, I'm going to go fly airplanes in the Air Force.
Right.
And so I went into ROTC and the way that UW was set up is that they had a fairly large ROTC unit. So you had a building where you had the Navy on like the top floor, the Air Force in the middle floor, and then the Army was in the basement. So I don't know what that says about like the way that
there's a metaphor somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's literally the way Clark Hall was, set up. And then so I went in there and, I think for me, like ROTC it felt really like natural because you're kind of among like-minded people still. And I think in the military in general, like you kind of find your people pretty quickly. And so I had a terrific experience like going in. I was in the dorms at that time. So I was doing kind of, entry to dorm life, entry to college life, going to RTC and, kind of enjoying all the things that you do as a freshman and then still waking up, 2 or 3 days a week at, 5, 6 in the morning to go do drill before classes.
What was the biggest shock to the system going into ROTC in college?
In ROTC? So I think, you're kind of, I guess the way that I would think about it is the biggest shock would be, I don't know if it's unique, but just the overall like assimilation into military, standards and all the other things that you have to kind of think about.
Yeah.
And I think that, kind of going into that and not really having a military background or like family members, there's people that are in your kind of ROTC group that they're military brats or it's like so natural to them. And, they just have this like knowledge of like and comfort level and, of what's going on around you and you're still doing it. And I think this is like this for a lot of people that have not been in the military before, whether you're going to basic or you're going to, RTC or the academy or anything like that. All right, I'm gonna try a little.
I just learned too that, or not learned, figured out that this apple pie dessert spread I think is supposed to go with
the marble pound cake.
With the marble pound cake, unless you're just supposed to eat it plain. But let's see if it improves
the. That's pretty good.
The snacks are always where they're at. If you just need some
Sustenance.
you need some food. Uh, it isn't here. Let me. Oh, I don't think you need. There you go. Let's try it with the. I'll give you a little.
All
Little
right,
spread
that's
right
good.
there. Improved, worse, better.
It's interesting. I think it might be better without.
I think you're right. I don't know if this. Maybe it's not supposed to be. Maybe you're just supposed to eat it. I agree. Without is probably the better route.
Gonna have to wash that one down.
Yeah. Well, they can't all be winners, right? So you're in college. When do you go to? It's not. Do you go to basic training? Or you just go through OCS in Air Force ROTC.
So in ROTC, I did a 4-year period of ROTC. Some people don't do all 4 years. They come in late. They can do a compressed 2 years. Again, this is all back when I went in. I don't know what it is today.
Yeah.
But so when I went in, there's a group of us that did all 4 years, and then there were some individuals that came in at about the kind of for the 3-year or 2-year point, meaning they just did the last 2 or 3 years. And then what you do is you go to a summer training program. And I want to say that was 4 weeks.
Okay.
I'm going to test my memory here. 4 or 5 weeks.
We will fact check you.
Yeah, fact check me later. And so for me, that was between my sophomore and junior year. And so you go do that training program. And I would hesitate to equate it to going to basic because it's a reduced thing. But that's kind of like for folks that have been through OTS or other things, it's kind of like that. Yeah. Meaning it's a compressed program of how do you become an officer? How do you kind of go through the whole, kind of experience of going to, basic training experience.
Right.
And so you do all that there because when you're doing the ROTC stuff, you're doing that. I had classes. So I had an actual class that I would go to that was an ROTC class, and it was structured, and you do leadership fundamentals, you do history, you do all these other things in that classroom environment as part of your normal curriculum. And then you were doing your morning drills. So 2 or 3 days a week, you're doing, early morning, just
PT,
hour PT.
Yeah.
Either PT or you were out there marching and you were doing all that stuff. But again, those were chunks of an hour, hour and a half.
Yeah.
So you're kind of doing that all through college. And then of course it's a, large time commitment. So you're still coming into the ROTC building at random points to do projects or extra stuff, or it becomes very much like your social kind of group while you're in college. At least that was my experience.
At any point, did you feel what the hell am I doing? What did I sign up for? I should just be a normal student, maybe become a Delta pilot afterwards, not a sponsor. Or were you kind of this is exactly what I wanted? What was the experience like? Because, especially at ROTC, unlike the academies where everyone's going through the same thing, and so you don't see the people partying on a Wednesday night or, going out to the party.
Hey, I'm walking here.
Hopefully that air horn isn't being picked up.
Sounds New York City.
But you don't see those, the kind of the other option, quote unquote. So in ROTC, you've got buddies or friends or classmates, going out on a Wednesday night drinking, but you might have to wake up at 5 a.m. where they might sleep in and pass their first class.
After my freshman year, I was in the dorms my freshman year. I went into a fraternity. Mm-hmm. So then I actually went in there because 2 of my good friends who were in RTC with me, one of them was 3 years older than me, and then another was a year older than me. And they were in this fraternity that, I didn't know anything about fraternities at the time either, going into college. So my freshman year in the dorms and then doing ROTC, I kind of became good friends with these 2 guys that were in this fraternity, and they brought me over and, kind of recruited me. And I ended up joining that fraternity starting my sophomore year. And so I spent, 3 years of my college experience of traditionally we would do the ROTC stuff Friday mornings.
Okay.
So I want to say we had to be there at 6 a.m. or something. And so you would, be either drilling or PT or whatever it was on the Friday morning. And Thursday night is traditionally party night.
Thursday.
Right?
Yeah.
So the college experience was, there was very many times that I was putting my uniform on and walking out while everybody is still like everybody
my
by there are
God.
multiple people still hanging out on,
Yeah.
couches and saying bye to me that have not gone to bed that night.
Oh my God.
And so you end up with like, I think I appreciated also having that kind of experience of like in the fraternity, I was very much exposed to really a very focused group of other, friends that were in the fraternity that like were focused on trying to still get their career going out of college. But here I am like, going into the military and having a very experience while I'm in school, right?
Yeah.
They're focused on academics and other things. Not to say that I wasn't, but like that was
You knew
just
the route.
part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I knew the route and I kind of just already had a job lined up afterwards.
And I guess, it forces you to be disciplined, right? I mean, in the sense of when you go into the college environment, a lot of the times the biggest difficulty isn't necessarily the academics. It's just, I can kind of do whatever I want. Where should I be focusing my time and energy? And if there's not a good carrot on the stick, you can find yourself pretty lost. I mean, having served in the military and then gone to school, one of the biggest challenges for me was I had joined a fraternity when I transferred, and then I was part of a club and all this other stuff. And then it became like, I got to go to class, but then I also want to do these social things and meet new people. And that's super, super important because a lot of what college is just like networking and meeting people to open up those doors for you down the line. But academics is still important, right? I mean, thankfully, once you're out of my situation, my GPA didn't matter too much. I don't necessarily get asked about it really ever anymore. But it was still a challenge trying to have fun, quote unquote, and have the college experience while not completely letting my my grades dive bomb after transferring.
Yeah. It's kind of the endless options, right? That
Yeah.
you're sitting there exposed to. And I think, for me, I gravitated towards, especially in the fraternity, like there's all these just interesting opportunities to meet people, alumni and all these other things. And then you did get exposed to business leaders and other things. And so, I think that was interesting to be exposed to that, why I'm still on this track to go into the Air Force. And, and I was always like very much interested in, kind of taking advantage of these like leadership opportunities. So I ended up being president of the fraternity while I was like taking leadership roles in like the RTC side.
So learning about it and applying it at the same time.
Yeah. And so I think for me, it was something that's just naturally where I always kind of gravitated towards. I just liked being in those roles and everything. And, that wasn't necessarily like conducive to being super hyper focused on getting exceptional grades or academics. Cause you kind of, something starts to give a little bit when you're really focused on this kind of like, I don't want to call it extracurricular, but like these things that, aren't directly related to your course loads. I was working at the time, so I was like valeting cars at night. So it was like a busy time for me. And I think that at least from the ROTC experience, that was like just something that you kind of, when you do the ROTC experience at a college, you do have that constant balance of like, you're doing this military thing, but you're also like all these other things are, you might still be working, you might be doing all those other things. And that was not uncommon for a lot of, the folks that I was doing ROTC in college with.
College seemed to be a great time. You graduate then directly into pilot school, which is, I'm assuming, the proper nomenclature.
Yeah. So the way that you actually have to compete in college for a pilot slot.
Okay.
So, for me, I guess I was just completely naive to this. Like, I just assumed like, I go into the Air Force ROTC and I go fly airplanes because why wouldn't I do that?
Yeah.
The reality is it doesn't really work that way. You get in there and into the ROTC program, and then you actually have to compete for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I think all the stuff goes up the end of your sophomore year, and your package then, competes for a pilot slot. And it's not like something that, everybody gets.
Right.
So you have to meet all the medical requirements.
Yep.
And at that time I wore glasses. Like if I would have been basically 2 years older, I would have not have been able to be a pilot.
Right.
Because of the vision that I had. So this was something that, again, like I just was like kind of naive to all this, and just going, just assuming things would work out, which ended up working out fine. But you meet the medical requirements, and then you have you're competing with these other factors in terms of you do this like test that's kind of like a pilot aptitude test.
Right.
And so they factor that in. And I think they factor in some other things in terms of like, ratings that your instructors or whatever give you.
Did you know what you wanted to fly? Or was it just, I'm happy to be here?
I'm a child of like the Top Gun era.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I was like, definitely grew up with Top Gun and that in mind.
You want,
so I wanted to
you were
fly
like, call me
fighters. I was
Maverick?
like, oh yeah, absolutely. Like, and I think for me, that's kind of what I definitely wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's part of the naive or like confidence of like, well, why wouldn't I like just go into the Air Force and fly, all these fighters and get all the slots. So, so you compete and then you get the pilot slot. And then your last 2 years of, for me, college, I knew that I was going to be going to pilot training after college.
Was that a sigh of relief of, I did all this work and at least I know I'll be flying? Because what happens if you don't get selected? Are you then just required to take some sort of other job?
Other job, yeah.
And then are you allowed to pick, or is it just
you do?
Hey, you're going to be a whatever.
Yeah, you do have picks, like so you do have options there, and I want to say that it was a list that you were putting together at that point when you were applying for the pilot slot.
Yeah. Did you know which plane? So you said fighter plane.
Don't know any of the planes. It's just you're going to pilot training.
Oh, so you just know I will be a pilot, but not specifically flying X, Y, or Z.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
So, and this has all changed a lot, I think over the last 20 years now and how they do it. But at that time, you really are you kind of have two options at that time. One of them was to go to a Euro-NATO training. And so that one, you actually were kind of guaranteed to go into like a fighter, because they only trained in T-37 and T-38, which was the fighter kind of trainer. And then everybody else went to like general Air Force pilot training. And at that time, it was flying a T-37, which was this small little Cessna jet.
Post-production.
You're like post-production? Okay.
Yeah. That's the editor's
the
note to myself.
Nice.
Yeah. I'll post myself here going.
Excellent.
What I'm actually doing.
The T-37, and then you roll in and you train either in a T-1 or a T-38 if you're in one of the other pilot training bases. T-1 track was this Beechjet 400, kind of like a business jet, and that one you go down to the cargo track. That's what I ended up doing.
Okay.
And then the other one would be a T-38, which takes you down the fighter track of, at that time, F-16, F-15,
right.
F-22s were kind of starting to come out then. And so those are kind of like your options. And so I didn't get selected for Euro-NATO pilot training, so I went down the general pilot training track and went to Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio, Texas.
How did that feel? I mean, again, growing up on Top Gun, was that hey, it is what it is, or kind of a punch to the gut? How did it feel? And right, there's
like
you need pilots for everything,
training.
right?
Yeah,
I mean, if you're kind of dead set on one specific route and it's not afforded, and again, there's no real, especially within the military, it's you kind of get what you get, and there's no real kind of going back afterwards.
Yeah, so the way that the pilot training selection works is that, again, this is at that time, but like we were there for a year, and you do 6 months in the first kind of period of training. So that was in the T-37. So you do this ground school, and then you're doing this very intense training in the T-37, and you're doing everything. You're doing all the like instrument training, you're doing all the aerobatics, you're doing, kind of the fundamentals of flying. And then you get into like formation flying and everything. And so overall, like I did very well in majority of that, especially with having the flying background.
Yeah.
When you get into more of the advanced instruments and you get into the formation flying and all of that, it starts to become clear at like what you're maybe better at or, not as good at. And I also got airsick. So I had like a lot of passive air sickness. And so all these things, like the reality starts to hit you of like, maybe fighters isn't the best track.
Right.
And so for me, it became kind of, although I still wanted to go that track, like the logical track for me to go down was more of like the cargo track.
What was the hardest part for you, having had pilot experience before in high school? Did you kind of go in, maybe not a chip on your shoulder, but like, I've kind of got this? And was there any reckoning on maybe it was the formation flying, or maybe it was just like the high intensity maneuvers that got you? Was there any kind of shock while going through pilot training?
I think there's kind of two things that stand out. One was that the level of kind of academics, I think that a lot of things you think like, oh, you go fly airplanes, it's stick and rudder skills and all these other things. And the reality is like a lot of the really great pilots are, especially in the fighter world, they're exceptionally good at like multitasking and memorizing things and learning like all the weapon systems and all of these other things. And so that's certainly something that, you don't do. And when you're going through like 17-year-old fly a Cessna, you're just focused on landing and doing all these other things. And then you get into like the military flying world. And I mean, you're out there to operate a weapon system and talk to people on the ground and like,
max range of an AGM-114. What's IPPP?
All of these things.
Like,
exactly. Like, and that's right. You were trained in forward controller stuff. So like, there's a lot that goes into flying that airplane that isn't really flying the airplane. And so because you're operating that, weapon system. Yeah. And so I think that was something that, stood out to me as like, oh, wow. Like, the intensity of like memorizing these giant things and then getting, kind of simulating a stressful environment, even in the classroom and grilling you on them. That was one thing. I think the second thing is that you just have a lot more going on in the airplane when you start going upside down and other things. So for somebody that gets like passive air sickness, like that's a little hard to focus and like fly when you get like all that. So you start to realize like there's also a lot more going on physiologically when you're operating these airplanes.
It always impressed me. I mean, I would love to be a pilot at some point, whether that just be a private pilot or what have you. But as a JFO, I mean, there was a lot of you're running around, with the infantry, you're calling up to the aircraft. But I was always still impressed by the aircraft because all I have to worry about is me running around. Maybe where the other platoons are. But this guy or gal is flying a multi-million-dollar aircraft, flipping it upside down, looking around or using their pod as they're flying, and the amount of coordinating that they do is truly incredible. And they're flying a plane, writing down on the notepad, maybe making a marker on their not windshield or whatever the canopy. I don't know what the word would be. Yeah. It's a lot. I mean, it's a lot going on in a very kind of short period of time, and to juggle all of that is truly impressive. What was the kind of ending of a pilot's training and transition now into full-time Air Force pilot?
Yeah. So for me, like I was selected to fly C-17s, which is what I wanted. So at that time, I really wanted to fly the C-17. It was newer in the inventory. So the C-17, they were really flying like starting around 97, 98. And, this is 2003 when I was leaving pilot training, started in 2002 and finished pilot training in 2003. And so at that time, like the C-17 was one, just an incredible like aircraft. And then two, this was also when we were involved very heavily in Afghanistan and Iraq by that point. Yeah. And so that aircraft was partially by fortune was just designed absolutely perfectly for what we were doing overseas at that time, because it was a transcontinental kind of aircraft, giant jet that could fly over the ocean very well and fast, or from Germany down into country, but you can also operate in austere locations. Yeah. And so that was all like really appealing. And then the added benefit was that it was also in like really great bases. Yeah. So the C-17 at that time was in McCord Air Force Base up south of Seattle in Tacoma, Washington, or at Charleston. And so you kind of had these great locations, and then those expanded into like Hawaii and California and up in the East Coast. So at that time, I really wanted to fly the C-17, and so I got that. And then you go to Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma, and I did another couple months of training dedicated in the C-17. And then I was assigned to McCord Air Force Base. So kind of a little bit of a homecoming for me, to go back up there and then fly the C-17 out of McCord.
How was it at the kind of height of the conflict, flying? Like, was that any kind of going through any part of your mind? Was it you just knew you wanted to fly? At this point, and I might get your background, you met your wife in college.
I did, yeah. So actually, yes, we met in college, but interestingly enough, like if you back up, like, I started college in 1998. So this is pre 9/11. Yeah. And it was also a little bit of a lull, right? Cause you were post Gulf War I, you were in that period where, even the pilots I was talking to in 99, 2000, were like, going on these field trips or whatever to go talk to pilots and, in ROTC, and they're just talking about like flying around the world and going to
hanging
Hawaii.
out. Yeah,
and like,
yeah.
it's like the greatest job ever, especially for a lot of the cargo guys at that time, because they were just kind of cruising around on road trips. And I was actually in Berkeley with my now wife, because she was going to UC Berkeley when 9/11 happened. So I was actually down there visiting her when all that happened. Of course, that would have been my junior year, and things very much changed in terms of what I was going to be going into out of college at that point. But by then, I'd already had my pilot training slot, kind of. And I think there's a sense of also, being 20, 21 years old, you just kind of, you don't really quite know everything and all the implications of what you're going to. You're just focused on well, wow, this is like my time to serve. And like, I was very much like excited at that point to go do that and actually be operational and all of those things. And so getting through pilot training was more of like the path into that, right? So you went through all these things over the next 2 years. And then I landed at McCord in 2003, which was, we'd already kind of kicked off all the conflicts, but it was still very early.
Yeah.
And so for me going in, I walked into McCord and I had this experience where, so I got assigned to one squadron. I got assigned to actually the 7th Airlift Squadron out of McCord. And, or I got assigned to the 4th, sorry. So the 4th Airlift Squadron out of McCord. They had 4 squadrons at the time. And I walk into the 4th, and there's like 2 people in the squadron. This is a squadron that's supposed to have like a couple hundred, pilots and crew members and load masters all assigned to them. There's like 2 people working the desk. It's just a ghost town.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm like, hey, how's it going? And then they're like, oh, well, Jason Wilbur. They're like, oh, I think you got reassigned to a different squadron, actually. And I'm like, okay. So this is like my first experience going to the squadron.
Yeah.
And so they're like, you think you need to go over to the 7th? It turns out that actually like the squadron commander of the 7th had requested me to come over there because he had somehow known somebody else I knew, and he was shuffling people around. So that didn't really matter too much, but like, this is my first experience of like, oh great, I'm getting, shuffled around.
Yeah. Welcome to the military. You're in the wrong spot.
Welcome to the military,
go
exactly.
somewhere else.
And so I literally have the wrong patches on because I still have 4th patches they'd given me, prior to going in.
Yeah.
And I go over to the 7th Airlift Squadron. It's the same thing. I walk in and there's like 2 people that are working the desk, and they're basically like, get your stuff, come back to your in processing, and then we'll get you start flying. And, there's a lot that goes into like ramping you up, but effectively fast forward a couple months. And, from that point for the next 2 or 3 years, I was just on the road like 300 days a year, 250, 300 days a year. Because that was just the state of operations in the kind of cargo airlift world.
Let's start getting your pizza heated up so that we can give it a good little try here. I don't know why they gave me a heater packet as well. I don't even know if you're supposed to heat up the pizza. We could just do it cold or have it cold.
Might just open it and see.
We'll play it by ear. I mean, I don't know if I guess as a pilot, you probably had this, even if it wasn't an MRE, just a good old Starkist tuna. So during your, being married, being on the road that much, how did you balance that? I mean, there's really no work-life balance traveling that much.
No, we were, so Michelle and I were engaged at that point. And then we were fortunate that she's from that Seattle area. So when we lived in there, when we were up there, we were pretty fortunate. She jokes that she just basically like spent a lot of time on date nights with her parents at that point, because she basically moved back home, and then before we were married, and then I was gone so much that she just kind of hung out with her parents.
Yeah.
So I think there's a sense of resilience that she had there to kind of just get through all that.
Yeah.
And then things did eventually slow down for me. After a couple of years, we went down to Travis Air Force Base, and they slowed down a lot. But yeah, during that period of time, there was no way around it. You were just gone a lot.
You just got to do it.
And the way that the cadence kind of worked for pilots was there was, I ended up doing deployments, but at that time you would go do 21 to 30 day trips. So you would like leave McCord Air Force Base, pick up something on the East Coast, and go over to, Europe, usually Germany, Ramstein Air Force Base. And then you would fly down, and then you would go down to Al Udeid, outside of Doha, and you would fly kind of out and backs from there for like 2 to 3 weeks. And then you would work your way back home as a crew, and you would land, and then you'd be home for like 1 to 3 days. And then they'd be like, you're back out. And then you were just kind of doing that perpetually.
Right.
So at that point, it wasn't even for that first 2 or 3 years there, you didn't quote deploy, but you were just constantly like gone for 2 or 3 weeks. And then you were home for a day or 2 or 3 days or whatever, unless you had some other training.
We're always jet lagged.
You were just kind of always going, yeah, well, you're kind of just a rolling clock. And then
I guess, there's no such thing as jet lag if you don't stop, I guess, right?
Yeah, you just kind of kept going. And you know, there's breaks where I had to go back to like Altus Air Force Base for a little while for training, or you could still take, you know, some time off. So unlike being deployed, you still had that opportunity. And then we started doing kind of squadron deployments at some point there. And so you'd go out as a unit and spend 3 or 4 months deployed, fly as a unit, and then come back home.
The most fascinating kind of tidbit of knowledge was years later. I think we found out last year when we were chatting that you may have, with a slight probability or slightly higher than no probability, flown me from Kyrgyzstan to Afghanistan, which was just the funniest happenstance of overlap. You being in the same area as me, 2012. And being one of the potential pilots, because you said it's like there was 3 pilots there that was doing that back and forth, or
there would have been multiple crews, right, going back and forth constantly. Right. So, but yeah, the timing, you'd have to look up all the dates.
Exactly. I just think that's very funny having. Again, I'm gonna say that you flew me just for the story of
just go with it.
10 years later, 12 years later, meeting the pilot who flew me into Afghanistan. What was the rest of your service like? Did it start to calm down a little bit? Hopefully, I mean, you were in for 6 years or no,
10 years. So yeah, so I mean, earlier you mentioned like you actually were much more astute than I was at a young age, going like, 10, 11 years in the military. So I signed a 10-year pilot training commitment, or from the point you graduate pilot training. And so for me, you know, I didn't even really think about that, I guess. At the time, I was like, well, I want to fly airplanes. And so I don't know, where's the dotted line?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I was like by contract going to be in the Air Force for 11 years because it was a year of pilot training. And then the clock started on that 10-year contract after pilot training. There was, I had peers that, you know, didn't start pilot training right away. So their clock actually didn't start until 6 months, a year after they graduated college. And then they started the 10-year clock. And so I didn't really even think about that at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, like looking back, I probably could have looked at that a little bit more, because I got to like pilot training and the academy, you know, folks that I was like in pilot training with, they're all talking about like doing 20 years. And I'm like, what? I never even thought about that.
Mean?
That like,
what do you mean?
What's this career? I just thought I was going to come fly airplanes and like, you know, do all of that. And hadn't really even honestly thought about all of that. Yeah. And then hadn't really thought through the implications of being in the military for 10, 11 years and being 31 or 32 now when, you know, I was going to separate. So, you know, I think that hit me about 5 or 6 years in, because, and that gets into more of my, you know, kind of like current world of, you know, still being interested in business and the other things that I really kind of ultimately just wanted to do with my life.
Yeah.
But you kind of naturally, you know, are balancing that. And so I was in the Air Force for 11 years. I did C-17 for a majority of that. And then the last couple of years, I served in like a completely different unit, doing some testing and flying a C-32. It's like a Boeing 757.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how I concluded my last couple of years. Mm-hmm. And during that period of time, I got much more involved with like acquisitions and you know, and that gets into more like what I've always been interested in, and, you know, doing a lot of software development and all these projects I'd done along the way. And, you know, so in the Air Force, the thing that ended up happening was the unit I went into was doing a lot of design and testing around like avionics systems and antennas and all these other things. And so I got involved working with like acquisitions and contractors and like doing system design and all of that, at the same time of kind of going, okay, well, I actually really like this. And I've done all these other kind of projects since I was very young, developing websites and software and being a nerd. And that kind of like hit me of like, this is actually what I probably really want to be doing.
Yeah.
Like not.
Well, so then you're doing that in the Air Force. Did you ever think, well, maybe I just continue doing this in the Air Force, or did you realize that it would have been better suited in the civilian world, or you would just have greater flexibility to do those things outside of the
I
military?
did. I actually had an opportunity when I was about ready to separate. So this is as I was kind of communicating like, hey, I think I want to, leave active duty. They pitched me on this job that was to go run like an R&D cell effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like on paper, it was basically like the dream job. It was like, go there and run this kind of like R&D cell, do all this really interesting things with airplanes and, other stuff. And get to really be, in the weeds, be a nerd, but also be a pilot, also like do all these other things, kind of like the best situation ever, right? Your Tony Stark workshop of like, being able to play around. And
Government budget.
Government and the reality is in the military, right? You do have, especially at certain levels, like access to do really, really interesting things in, operational and mission context, right?
Yeah.
That you can't do in the civilian world. And so I recognize that. But I think that for me, I think I always still, well, I look back and like, I wouldn't change anything really, because at that time I was weighing, well, I'm still going to be, at that time I was a major, but I'm going to still be a major lieutenant colonel here. And I can see what they're going to want to do with me, right? They're going to still want me to go to do professional development and go do, an operational command and all these other things. So I knew that that was still going to be a short-lived period of time. Like I would go do that job for a couple of years, and then the machine was going to naturally like take back hold of me and want me to go do stuff that I didn't necessarily want to do. Not that it was bad. It's just not what I wanted to do. And so I kind of recognized that. And then I think, so that was one thing is I didn't want to get tied up in not having a little control over, those next 10, years in my career. And then two, there's a big piece of me that still was very much, I guess, like hungry to go see if I could do it in the outside.
Yeah.
Kind of that capitalist entrepreneurial
mindset. Without
mindset.
The safety net, or, you've gotten this experience or you've been able to do these things, but within the confines of the government or within the confines of the Air Force. And now it's like, well, let's see if we can step it up a notch, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I think there's some realities of being in the military and the government, right? Like you take these jobs, you're constrained on how much money you can make, you're constrained on where you can live and like who you can like talk to and have access to. And those are done in a very particular way, and they're all the right reasons, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you as an individual are going to be able to really, go out there and, capitalize on the things you're building and, all this other stuff. And so I kind of wanted that opportunity. And I had, when I was in the Air Force run, kind of a little side business, if you will. But so when I was there, a friend of mine that was flying C-17s and I got the idea of doing a series of like mobile apps. So this is right after the iPhone came out. And we developed like a per diem calculator app. So this was like an app that you could kind of calculate your travel expenses and per diem. We'd done that. We'd done like a couple other kind of financial, like kind of quote calculators. But this is like very early iPhone. This is like 20, 30,000 apps in the app store type period. And inherently, like we did those, and we ran that company for kind of 4 years, and it was phenomenal experience. But I also like experienced being very constrained in what I could do because we weren't really there to make like money on it. It was more of a experience because we were, still in the Air Force. And so we did that, and we ran that. But I think that also like kind of whet my appetite of like the startup world and the quote tech world and like all the things you could do if you didn't have these constraints placed on you as being, kind of more of a government employee and other things.
We don't have to talk about this, but family dynamics, you're married, you might have kids at this time, or what was it like? Again, I mean,
when I was getting out?
Yeah. I mean, the both pros and cons of the government safety net is you have a great job security, you have benefits, you have insurance. There's a lot of things that help you out. When you go in the civilian world, you don't have that. Was there any discussions on kind of what your next steps were going to be, or how to maintain a level of either financial comfort or just stability, whether that be job, health insurance, etc.?
I think from the perspective of like, I think for me, like Michelle had already known that I wanted to like go do these things, and so it was not like a quick decision for us. It was like a decision that evolved over many, many years. And so that was like a plan that we'd kind of put in place to like go ahead and leave active duty. And, I ended up going into the reserves and still serving in the reserves and retiring. And so like, there's a sense of like, maybe there was a little bit of a safety net because we had a plan to go do that, and kind of continue serving in that way. But in terms of taking the risk and the leap to like go into kind of corporate life and leave this, very much defined kind of 20-year career path, I think for me, we'd planned for it. And then I had some exceptional mentors, and I did some transition programs at that time that were really instrumental. One of them, there's a reason I'm out here in New York this week with the Commit Foundation, an organization that like I was like part of. Yeah, like just a phenomenal organization with Anne-Marie Craig that led that and built that. And so I had these experiences like as I was getting ready, and I was pretty intentional about getting ready to like transition out of the military. Around like, I remember one talking with one individual, and he's like, I've never really met anybody that didn't land on their feet after they got out of the military. And obviously there's exceptions, but the point being that like if you plan for it, like you'll be fine, right?
Yeah.
And so it took a lot of folks like that giving that confidence to go ahead and, take that leap, that I got comfortable with it, that it was going to work out okay.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of self-doubt, right?
It is. I mean, you bring up that organization. I mean, the ones that I shout out all the time, Service to School and Warrior Scholar Project, were ones that I learned about in 2015. And although there were a lot of unknown questions, I felt confident that there would at least be a path for me, whether that be the path I was thinking about or the path I wanted, to be determined. But I knew that with relative certainty that I'd be successful one way or the other. And that could take a lot of different shapes. But just having somebody to talk to, having somebody who's gone through it before, and knowing what those opportunities look like, I think are incredibly important as you're getting out, rather than getting out and trying to figure it all out right then and there, which happens. I mean, there was still a bunch of stuff I was figuring out as I was getting out, but at least had about a year. I mean, I only had a 4-year contract, and, that kind of last year was when I decided I'm probably going to get out. Let's start planning now what that looks like. Before we get into Jason the civilian, I'm going to have to torture you just a little bit, and we can do a 1-bite score on the MRE pizza.
I don't think you heat this.
I don't think so either. I think they're just going, they're going cold pizza style.
Well, here, I'll just tear it.
Yeah, here.
And you can take a chunk there.
And the irony of us being in New York right now, home of great pizza. Cheers. Oh, it's so dry.
So dry.
You
know, it's like that pizza that you would get like your like foil packs or whatever when you were in
Elio's or whatever.
Just like, yeah.
Yeah,
that's really dry.
All right.
It's got the good chemical aftertaste.
Mm-hmm. Out of 10, what would you put your MRE?
The pizza or the MRE? Because the cookie was good.
Let's go pizza first. Rate the pizza, and then we can do total MRE score.
The pizza was edible, but that's probably a 2.
I'd put it, probably at a 3. If I was really hungry, maybe 3.5. I would eat it if I was starving, but that was incredibly dry. Overall MRE, what would you put it at?
Cookie was good. I'd give it a 5.
5? This is the first one that I'm actually shocked, because I assumed this was going to be the better tasting one. I'd probably put 5 or 6 for that.
How's your tuna?
My tuna, this one I'm putting at an 8.5, because I mean I buy canned tuna in the store. I do tuna salads or
Can't
tuna.
Go wrong with
Yeah,
it.
exactly. So this is probably one of the best ones if you have to have an MRE, but you don't want an MRE. This is just you grab tuna.
Well, you got like the branded experience because you got Reese's Pieces here too, right?
Got Reese's Pieces. I got Star-Kissed with camo on it.
Yeah.
No, this is basically just a regular old
like sponsored
can. Yeah, exactly. Sponsor Star-Kiss. we're coming up on time, but I want to hear a little bit about Jason the civilian. What did that journey look like? You're at Oracle right now, but how did you get from Air Force pilot, flying C-17s to director level at Oracle?
Yeah, so it was a long road.
Yeah.
So
it didn't happen overnight, you're telling me.
No. The way that I think about this is that even when I got out of the Air Force and got a job at Amazon. This would have been back in 2013. And so when I went into the Amazon interview, I talked about being in the military, and this is partially like the benefit I had of doing these, having great mentors and like other folks, to kind of prep me for that. But I didn't talk a ton about being in the military. I talked a lot about, the experience of doing these technical projects. And the reality is that I've been kind of a nerd for, since I was very young, building computers and doing all these other things. And so I'd always been very interested, and I'd spent a lot of effort and time really going deep into like how you build software. And like I'd done it before, and I had all these other great examples that weren't directly being like a pilot in the Air Force. And it certainly had, times in that interview process where I talked about, things that I'd done in the military. But it was really about like getting into Amazon was more about, and I talk about this when I talk about really anybody that's interviewing or getting ready to get hired. You're being hired to fill a particular task or a role that they have a gap, right? That's the reason they're hiring somebody. And yes, they want to know about you as a person and all these other things, but for many of the jobs that aren't like operational type jobs, they're hiring you for a skill or, kind of a repeatability of something you've done in your past.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a key thing that got me into kind of this tech world was, yes, there's the intangibles and the experience of being a leader and, all these other things. But the reality was they were hiring me to be, a product manager at Amazon.
Yeah.
At that time, it was Amazon Pay. And so they wanted me to be able to learn how to do APIs and, the payment structure and be able to run an engineering team and all these other things. Like I needed to be able to do that. And if I couldn't do that, all the other intangibles were like kind of irrelevant.
I struggled with that for a long time, and it's something I have to continue reminding myself is that for a long time, I spoke about my military service or even just my work experience as a lot of intangible stuff, like a lot of soft skills. And maybe I would even bring up some hard skills. I did this or I'm good at that. But being able to relate that and make that direct correlation of I've done this and this is why this would apply to this job, or this is the skills that you need and this is why I have them, is a challenge. And it takes a lot of time to practice that, because a lot of the times, or at least for me, I'll say something and I'll assume you're drawing the same correlation as I am, or you're connecting the dots the way I'm connecting my dots. The reality is that's not the case. And I remember when I was between things, I was in an interview and I was an early stage startup and I was talking about all the things that I did. And the guy point blank went, okay, but what is that going to solve for us? Or like, how are you actually going to solve things for us? And I botched I didn't get the job. I botched the answer because I was just so used to being like, well, I've done this and I've done that. And I've done in this context, but never actually taking the time to be like, and this is why it matters for this job specifically.
Yep. And I think it's interviewing is a skill and all these other things. So that goes into it as well, like knowing how to like figure out what they're looking for. But I think at the end of the day, like that is a key thing, is like observing that like they're hiring you for a particular role to do a particular thing, and they want a good people. But like, yes, you need to be able to like really recognize that. And so for me, like going into Amazon, I got that job. And then you asked like how I got to where I am now. Now it's been almost 11 years of me being in industry. So, I'm basically at the point now where I've spent longer in, the tech world than I have as an Air Force pilot. And so now it's very different. Now it's more of the career journey of like, I don't, the military experience is now pretty buried down in my resume. And so but that first 5 years of kind of post-military, it was about really like at Amazon figuring out how to operate in a corporate environment, being successful at that, moving into management, figuring out how to be successful at that. and then, kind of being ambitious enough to take like risks. And so I took risks of, moving from one org that I was doing very well at Amazon and going over to AWS opportunistically, and that worked out. And then a friend of mine had gone out and went to a company called Coupang, which was like this Amazon.com of South Korea. So I took the leap of leaving Amazon to go like follow him over there and work for him. And again, kind of had the other experience of now meeting a whole new group of people, and, different experience leading engineering teams all around the world and all those other things. And all of that just builds. And so then at some point, by the time I went into Oracle, which is where I'm at now, I'd kind of had that basis. And then it was just continuing the progression of, managing bigger teams and going into executive leadership and, all of those things that just take time throughout your career.
Not to ask this question through a negative lens, but a lot of times people talk about all the benefits of the military in terms of you get this good skill, you get this good skill. Was there anything that you felt like you had to break from the military that you had learned, or was a, not necessarily a personality trait, but something that worked really well within the Air Force that didn't necessarily translate to the civilian world or corporate world?
I think, well, there's, I think one thing.
Flying a plane, calling.
Yeah, that's totally like, yeah. I remember when I went into Amazon, like the first day I showed up at 7 o'clock because it's like, why wouldn't you show up to the office at 7 o'clock? Yeah.
And did they tell you that you were actually in the wrong squadron? And
No, they didn't do that. But I showed up and nobody was there for like 2 hours. Like I was like alone. So I think there's things like, I'd say that just interesting, experience. But I think, at the end of the day, like, if you're a motivated individual that's been a top performer, you're going to get thrown into an environment and that's not going to change.
Yeah.
And so whatever company you're at or whatever you've done. And so, I think the military is very good about getting you comfortable with those scenarios of being thrown into like something new or like having to just figure it out and just execute well. And so I think you take those intangibles in the way that you operate. And, if you've been successful at doing things in the military, you're going to be successful at doing things in the corporate world because it's just inherent. Like there's a pattern there that starts to resonate. And I see it with people that I hire them too. I think the things that, I was fortunate that Amazon is a very direct culture. So like when I went in there, meetings were really about being very direct and solving problems and not taking things personal.
Right.
And that was like very much the way a lot of the military stuff is, especially being a pilot. Like after you fly, you go debrief and you don't sugarcoat things.
Not doing the hamburger style of compliment.
No, like you're going to talk about the good things. But you're going to like just be very direct about when things didn't go well, or like you need to figure things out. Right. Cause it's just the way you operate. So for me, like Amazon was very natural in that way because culturally, it's very direct. I think that the things that maybe didn't translate as well is, when you get into the corporate world, you're not necessarily mission oriented. You're kind of like business objective oriented, which is a subtle difference because it's profit, it's other things. And so you have to really focus on some of the nuance and the politics and the other stuff that you don't necessarily have to pay attention to. And so that was a little bit new. And I think the other thing is that there's a difference between kind of management and leadership. And when you're in kind of a corporate environment, you would know this well as a CEO, like, in your experience, like if somebody's not delivering, the reality is they might get managed out. They might not be an employee anymore in your company. In the military, we're very mission focused, right?
Yeah.
Like we'll bring people along for,
just
the
counsel
mission,
them,
and like you'll figure it out.
Extra push-ups, and they'll eventually get there.
Yeah.
Maybe not in the Air Force. Can't really do push-ups and maybe C-17. You got enough room in the back to
do some of that. Yeah. But you invest in the people, and you really like have that core to your kind of nature. But like that's where I get into like there's a management. Like how do you hire people? How do you fire them? How do you like manage performance and all these other things? Is different than like leadership.
Yeah.
And so you get into that, and so that was a little bit different. And then of course it's just business world. So you just have to learn a different, set of skills and, things like that.
There's so many other topics that we can talk about, but, as we're coming up on time, what's the future hold for Jason Wilbur? Anything on the horizon, or how do you, maybe a better way to ask this question is, how do you think about the future? Is it kind of one foot in front of the other, or is there a grand narrative that you're kind of looking to kind of fill in?
That's a really good question. I don't always know what's going on 6 months from now.
So,
So it's
I am in the same spot, so no pressure.
I used to, I think of myself as a goal-oriented person, but the reality is I feel like I've learned now that these opportunities that are really interesting, a lot of times they're completely unexpected.
Yeah.
And when I joined Oracle, for example, I remember it took like 3 of like mentorship coffees before I even was willing to like even go talk to anybody at Oracle. Because at the time when I was looking at them, the brand wasn't strong. I was coming from Amazon Web Services, which was like super strong, compared to like Oracle Cloud. And so I, at that point, it was nowhere on my radar. And it took, having good mentorship and everything over the course of a little, month period or whatever to even like open that opportunity up. And so I never would have known that was going to be there. And then going in there, things just materialized, and it's been a great experience for me. So I think for me, like the what I think about is that really focusing on consistently delivering and executing well and taking care of people, it will open up doors to do bigger things, both within the world that I currently am in, or if, I want to explore, other things down later in my career. And I would say that like maybe one thing that has changed a little bit is that especially after, taking that little, which we didn't talk about, little break from Oracle to go do a CEO startup, role for a little over a year. I think really focusing on keeping relationships with really high performing people. Yeah. And not just like you have your friends, but I think also professionally, like focusing on building a network of like high performers is something maybe that I'm more prioritizing more than ever, because gosh, that's just like invaluable.
It's 100% true. I don't necessarily know where I'll be in 10 years from now, right? I think I have ideas, or, there are paths in which my life can go. I think people who say life is all about luck are kind of wrong. I think people who say life is all about hard work are wrong. I really do think that a lot of life is just that intersection of serendipity and hard work. There's definitely an element of trust. You bump into the right person, or you meet this individual, there's a chance encounter. But the hard work opens up more of those doors. So it's the harder you work, the more opportunities, or the more chances of those chance encounters will happen. And it's trying to find that balance. And then to the network itself. I mean, a lot of the reasons why I wanted and needed to go to college, a lot of the times people say, well, like college, you can learn that online, and you can, figure it out yourself, or you can just go to a library. And to some extent that is true. But the benefits of college isn't necessarily just the things that you learn within the classroom. It's you're building that network of professionals, and some are great friends, and others are just really hardworking individuals that you meet who down the line can open this door for you or provide you this opportunity. And whether that be a hire or, what have you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think
it's a lot.
Yeah, no. And I think like, one framing that I try to think about is, I think, where I've been happy and where I talk to other people, that are happy in quote their role or whatever is, are they sufficiently challenged? Are they in a role that they believe they can be successful at? And then are they rewarded? And that could be monetary, that could be, title. Like reward is different for every single person at that point in their life. And if you kind of have that mix of those 3 things, you don't always have equal amounts of all 3 of those. That ends up being a really interesting formula for like feeling like you're in a really good spot.
Yeah.
And so that's a framing that, I go back to a lot of times when I'm kind of thinking about what's going on in my career, or like, am I set up for success?
Jason, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Hopefully not too bad.
No.